Hi, nice to meet you.
Hello.
My name is Michael Oscar, and I'm the Volunteer Engagement and Retail Manager at the John James Audubon Center in Audubon, Pennsylvania. This is Jillian Saber. She's one of our faithful bird volunteers. She helps with the bird care, and she also does bird presentations. So we're going to have Jill talk to you with a special surprise tonight. She's going to have a guest speaker to talk to you. So I'm going to hand it over to Jill right now.
Hey guys, so I'm going to slide over into frame and hopefully she'll actually turn her head eventually to look at you. Oh, a little bit there. There you go. At this point, I would usually say, does anyone know what kind of owl this is? But everyone's muted, so I'm going to pretend there's somebody in the back saying that looks a lot like a screech owl. So Megascops Acio, the eastern screech owl, and that's what Scooter is. And she's been here at the center for about 6 years, I believe. She came to us all the way from Long Island. I'm sure as some of you may have noticed, she is missing, see if I can turn around, she is missing an eye, or she just adjusts her head. She is missing an eye right there, and that's from a car strike. All of our injured birds are from being hit by cars. So we always encourage people whenever they visit, say, hey, you know, if you're in your car and you're eating an apple or banana, something that will break down, never throw it out your window, even though it won't really hurt the environment, because when it lands on the side of the road, that attracts rodents and other prey animals, and that also attracts raptors like Scooter, and they get hit by cars. So yeah, the screech owl, these guys range from Canada all the way down through to Mexico, and they'll live in any sort of woodlands that they can find. So any place with plenty of trees with little cavities for them to live and nest in. They also do a very good job of living alongside people, more so than a lot of other species of owls, definitely better than the great horned or the barred owl. These guys have been found living and nesting alongside highways or on light posts in the middle of busy town squares. So really, they've adapted really well to living alongside people. They will, though, avoid territories that are inhabited by larger owls, because larger owls will eat smaller owls. So like the great horned owl and the barred owl, they're opportunistic predators. So anything they're strong enough to take down and eat, they will take down and eat. And that includes these little guys. So it's a rough life being a little owl. You have to be very careful. So one cool thing about the screech owl is they come in two primary colors. You have the red or the rufous morph, like Scooter. And also here at Mill Grove, we have a gray morph screech owl named Oscar. And that's an example in a species, it's called polymorphism. And that's when multiple members of the same species living in the same habitat, sharing the same space at the same time, can manifest in two or more different forms or colors or shapes. So there is also a brown variety. It's a lot more rare. I think they're found more down in Florida. And there's also a very light, almost light gray to like almost like a washed out screech owl variety, and they're more like Central America. So let's see if I can bring her a little bit closer and talk about, maybe she'll look, there you go. She has excellent camouflage. So you can tell like all the little bars and flecks. Turn her around a little bit. Yeah, so she's really suited to blending in maybe with trees with like a ruddier bark or like pines, especially in the autumn when the season's changing. While the gray morph, they're more suited to hardwood trees or hardwood barks. They're often, the eastern screech owl is often mistaken for their western cousins, the western screech owl. I believe the western screech owl is like a hair bigger, but also really easy way to tell them apart is the western screech owl will have a very dark beak, like almost like a black gray color, while these guys it's much lighter or even more of a yellow color. So again, thanks to their excellent camouflage, I mean, if you hold up these guys to a tree, they definitely disappear right against it. They're more often heard than seen, especially during the mating season in the spring. They have little trills and whinnies that they make. I always tell visitors, if you're out in your backyard and you're listening to all the night creatures and you hear what sounds like a very tiny horse whinnying out in the woods, that's a screech owl. They don't screech, contrary to their name. That's more so a barn owl thing, when it sounds like somebody's being murdered out in the woods. Definitely not a screech owl. So again, yeah, they're cavity nesters. They like little hollows in the woods. Even old holes that, they don't dig them out themselves. If they're created by birds, but they'll take over holes that were made by woodpeckers or flickers, species like that. Another really cool habit these guys have is, let me bring her a little bit closer. Maybe she'll look at you guys. Is they have a habit of catching, it's a very tiny species of reptile called a blind snake. They almost look like little worms. They're so small. What they do is they catch these blind snakes and they bring them back to their nests, and most of them get, eaten up by the little baby owls. But any that survive will tunnel down into the leaf litter and the nesting material, and they'll stay there. And what they'll do is they'll eat all the insect larvae that would be parasites to the little babies. So they actually did a study and found that screech owls that use the blind snakes in their nests, the chicks not only grew healthier, but they actually grew faster. So this is a really great example of two species kind of working together. Blind snake, not exactly a willing arrangement, but they kind of just get dropped into the nest and they make the most of it, those that are lucky enough to get away. So speaking of their diets, yeah, I mean, gosh, people think of owls catching mice, and that's true for this little girl. Small, mice, voles, they're even known to go after insects. Sometimes I also heard a case of them swooping down and getting little minnows, like out of a creek. So anything that's small enough that they can handle, they'll snag. When it comes to what eats these little guys, I had talked earlier about, larger owls going after them, but especially during the nesting season when they're more vulnerable and their babies are vulnerable, you have possum, skunks, minks, crows, even blue jays will come down and they'll destroy the eggs or the nests or the babies. So they really have a lot to contend with out there. Actually read recently about a case up in somewhere in New England. There was a barred owl that was found inside the barred owl was a long-eared owl, and inside the long-eared owl was a screech owl. So it's almost like this horrifying turducken of owls, but it just really is a great demonstration of just like, if it's small enough for me to eat, I'll eat it. So yeah, in their little nests, so they can lay anywhere between 1 to 6 eggs. I think the average I heard is about 4. But yeah, when they're hunting, despite their size, and she's only, maybe 5 or 6 ounces max, they're very, very small birds, about 20-inch wingspan. Despite their size, they're really, really fierce predators. That really goes for any owl, but even these guys, I mean, I think early authors referred to them as feathered wildcats, like they just had such a fierce little personality. But she doesn't have them up right now, which means she's comfortable, so that's good. But when you see a lot of photos of screech owls, they have 2 little tufts on the top of their head. Those aren't actually ears. They're just tufts of feathers. They can help with camouflage. Some people think maybe they're more so for social cues or both. Like that's not really a solid opinion on what they're for, but they aren't actually ears. Her real ears, they're just little holes hidden by her feathers, but they're actually offset on her head, so they're not symmetrical like ours. One's up a little bit higher and one's down a little bit lower. So when they're hunting, obviously they have excellent night vision, but they also rely a lot on what they can hear because they have very acute hearing for a bird. So what she'll do is she'll stand up on her perch, and if she hears a little mouse down in the leaf litter, those offset ears helps them to better triangulate exactly where that prey is. So whenever you see photos of, I think most popularly, maybe like a great gray owl diving into like a deep bank of snow, obviously they can't see the mice, but they can hear them. So the tiniest little heartbeat or rustle under the snow or under the leaf litter, and they just know exactly where to come down and strike. They have even these little guys, let's see if I can bring her a little bit closer. Even these little guys have very strong feet. So she has 2 toes up front and 2 toes in the back, and she has a very, very strong grip. Right now she's being pretty gentle with me, but even with the glove on, if she really squeezes, it's a little intense. But yeah, I'm trying to think for these guys, lifespan in captivity, close to 20 years, but obviously, we talked about all these things these owls compete with. It's really in the wild, it's a lot lower. I think the mortality rate among new chicks is something like 70%. So really just doing whatever we can to contribute to the continued survival of owls like these guys. I talked about not littering on the side of the road. Another one is not using rodenticide because, they gets into the rat or the mouse, and these guys eat it. So they're not a good way to go. But yeah. Do you have any questions about my friend Scooter here?
Nothing
Any
has
thoughts?
If anybody has anything, you put that in there. How many owls do you have at your facility?
5.
Five.
Yeah, currently we have 5 owls. We have 3 different species. So we have a great horned, a barred owl, and we have our eastern screech owls. So we have large, medium to large, and small.
She's beautiful.
Just gazing lovingly at Mike right now. So.
Yeah, she's like, I've never seen that hairdo before. What's up with that?
You got the tufts like she does.
Yep.
Yep.
She's
exactly.
like,
got your plumicorns.
he looks like a cardinal. I could eat a cardinal, but he seems kind of big. That's what she's thinking.
Okay, I don't see any other questions.
No
coming.
other questions? That means Jill did a wonderful job. Usually we get a lot of questions.
Oh, here we go. What is her actual size?
So weight only a few ounces. Length, I think they can get up to, I think, max like 8 inches. So she's very, very small. I mean, gosh, no, not much bigger than like a soda can sitting on my hand.
She's about the size of a soda can.
Yeah.
She's probably 5 inches.
And she's a little puffed up too. They're all feathers, so there's really not much to her. It's not taking much effort to hold her up. Not like working with Odin, our great horned owl, where you really have to, sit there for an hour, with your arm up. It starts to wear on you a little bit. But yeah, so in terms of all those dimensions of size, a very, very small owl. Not the smallest species. I think there's like the pygmy owl and there's the elf owl. They're even smaller than these guys.
So screech owls are some of the most diverse owls in the country because they're so widespread. So different populations in different areas, there's genes that are spread in that area. So they vary a lot. So they can be anywhere from like 4 inches up to like 9 inches almost. And it really depends where you are. It's odd that you would have a very small one next to a larger one living in the same habitat. It's just different parts of the country. But since they really span all the way from the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean to the Rockies, up into Canada, down into Mexico, there's a lot of variation in screech owls, in the eastern screech owls.
There's something like 5 or 6 different subspecies throughout the region. Yeah.
And so how do they eat the food? They just swallow it whole?
Whenever possible. Yeah, I know, I could go into too much grisly detail, but I know Scooter, if it's like a larger mouse, she will take it apart a little bit and then swallow as much as you can. But typically they want to swallow it all down at once. And anything they can't digest will come back up in the form of a tight, compact little pellet. And it's anything like fur, bones, and that's what you see kids will be dissecting in the classroom and coming across all the little ribs and jawbones and in there, they kind of piece them back together. But yep. So they'll swallow whole as much as possible.
Yeah. So it depends on size. Small things will swallow whole, big things, they'll rip them up if they need to. We once were doing a live similar program and we had a mouse, and while they were talking, one of our owls decided to rip the head off the mouse in a very gruesome fashion. So that does happen. They are predators, even they're small and cute and fluffy. They can be vicious if they want to. So,
and none of our owls are pets. They're not tame. So everyone's kind of taking a little hit, even from these little guys. Yeah.
So all our owls cannot, unfortunately, go back into the wild. So we have state and federal license in order to have them and use them for education programs. And like Jill said, they're not pets. So you got to be very careful about them because they are wild animals.
Mm-hmm.
Are they easy to train to do this? Like, how intelligent are they?
They're super intelligent, which means it's hard to train them because if they decide, they don't want to do what you want them to, they just don't do it. And they're hard to trick into doing something. So
not as food motivated as like a dog or a cat. You would think so. You think an animal would definitely, but yeah, it's definitely part of it, but not as easy. Yeah. They can be very stubborn when they want to.
But all of our birds, we've had or have been in captivity for a while, so they're very used to doing programs in humans, but doesn't mean you can't take your eye off them. I've learned that firsthand. You do not want to do that.
Nope.
Absolutely. Any last questions, guys? Don't be shy. Is she still able to fly with just the one eye?
Yeah, so she's fully flighted. So whenever at a rehab center, when they have an injured bird and they fix them up, they have a flight test that they do. It's this big L-shaped cage, and they see if they can navigate sharp corners, right? Like all of the skills they would need to hunt in the wild. So really, a bird that relies so much on their eyesight to hunt, it's just that she's losing like the half of that capacity. So flying, she's perfectly fine as far as we know. She can hear great. But missing eyes, like that's a no-go for a bird of prey.
Yeah, so the one problem, well, two problems with birds of prey that lose their eyes is that lack of depth perception. And the one, if they're unable to hunt, they might starve, and you don't want them starving to death, but also they're a lot more likely to injure themselves chasing after something because they fly into things because their depth perception's off. So that's why she is non-releasable.
Well, I appreciate her taking the time to meet us.
Thank you for having her, she says.
Absolutely. Thanks for all the questions, guys. If there's any last ones, speak now or forever hold your peace. Right. Well,
All right.
thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
All right, everyone say goodbye to Scooter.
Bye, Scooter.
So the less glorious side of when you have two people and you're doing a bird presentation is whenever the bird poops, then the person who's not holding the bird has to deal with that. So it's always fun. So if anyone saw me crawling around on the floor, that's what I was doing. So are we ready to talk a little bit about Audubon and do a little history and some art since we're all here?
Absolutely.
And I have a captive audience. I was just going to talk myself for hours, and then my girlfriend reminded me earlier today that no one wants to see me drone on for an hour. So we do have some PowerPoint slides, and I will also be bringing the laptop around the museum to point out some things that will help illustrate what I'm talking about. Can everyone hear me okay with this mask on, or would you like me to take it off? Okay?
I think you're okay.
All right, good. So I'm going to start. I'm going to share my screen here. Come on, there we go. All right, Kelly, you can see that okay?
Good to go.
All right. So John James Audubon, the namesake of our center and where the National Audubon Society gets its name from, is a famous 19th century artist, and he's famous for painting birds, hence the fact his association with the Audubon Society. But history-wise goes, even though he's one of America's most famous artists, he wasn't actually born in Audubon. And when I do my in-person tours, I usually give a test and ask people if they know where he was born, but I kind of gave it away with this slide. So he was born in Santo Domingo, which is modern day Haiti. He was born to French parents, and Haiti was a French colony at the time. So he was born in 1785. Audubon was only there till he was about 3. His mother was a chambermaid, and his father was a French sea captain, and he owned the plantation in Haiti, and he would take goods around from all over the world and bring them and sell them all over the world. He used his money and he invested in a sugar plantation, and he grew sugar. And his mother was not Captain Jean Audubon's wife. She was back in France. And unfortunately for little John, his mother died very early. She got a tropical disease. We're not sure where it was, what it was, and she passed away when he was very young, only a couple months old. So since he was illegitimate, he was given the name Jean, Rabin, and Rabin was his mother's name. So he was born Jean-Jacques Rabin in Haiti, which was a French colony. So, but when he was 3 years old, things in Haiti weren't very good for colonists. So Audubon's father kind of recognized this. There had been drought for several years. There was forced enslaved people to every colonist in Haiti. And Captain Audubon recognized this would probably not end well for most colonists. So he took young Jean-Jacques Rabin back to France, along with one of his half-sisters, which, by the way, was born to another different woman. So what can I say? He was French. So he brought Audubon and his one half-sister, who was of mixed race, but she was very light-skinned, back to France with him. And we believe the reason he took those two, John being Caucasian and his sister being very light-skinned mixed race, that if there was a revolt of slaves, that they would not fare well, which turned out to be fairly true. There was shortly after a revolution in Haiti, and most of the colonists were actually executed. So good for Jean-Jacques and for us as art lovers. They went to France, and John stayed there. Jean-Jacques stayed there till he was 18. But since he was illegitimate, he couldn't legally inherit property from his father. Now, surprisingly, Captain Audubon's wife accepted these children into their family with open arms, very open-minded at the time. And, but because they couldn't inherit, they couldn't technically, weren't technically children of Audubon, they actually legally adopted these children. So when that happened, Jean-Jacques Rabin changed his name to Jean-Jacques Audubon after his father. And he lived a pretty ideal life as a child. His family had money, he ran around the countryside, he liked to play in nature, he had a pet monkey. But when he became 18, it was the time of Napoleon, right? So things weren't so good necessarily in Europe at that time. So the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and he had just turned 18, and his parents were afraid he was going to be drafted into the military. So what to do with John? Well, when Captain Audubon sold his sugar plantation, which was a successful plantation in Haiti, he made a fair amount of money. And as you see this picture right now on your screens, Mill Grove was in Pennsylvania. It's the property I'm standing on right now. And on this property, there was a mill and there was a grove of trees, hence the name Mill Grove, and it was an operating farm. And Captain Audubon had been through this area. He knew the area, he had connections, and he used his money from the sugar plantation to buy this farm and mill in Pennsylvania. And there was also rumors of lead on the property. Now, we don't associate lead with good things these days, but back then lead was a very expensive commodity. It was used for bullets, especially at the time of Napoleon's War. So that was something it could be used for, but was used for all kinds of industrial uses. So this was one reason that Audubon probably also purchased the property. So, but when Jean-Jacques Audubon became 18, his parents wanted to protect him from going into the army. So they sent him to their property in America. They said, we'll send you to our property in America, and you can help run the family business, see if this brand new lead mine is actually a good mine, and if we can make money at it, and it would protect him. So Jean-Jacques Audubon came to America and came to Mill Grove, and he actually literally moved into the mansion that you see here in this painting, right in the center at the top of the painting there. With the tenant farmers. So the landlord actually moved in with the farmers, and I always was curious about how that kind of worked. But he was 18 and it was a Quaker family, and I think the mom really kind of adopted him into their family. So that was nice for him. But he came to America and he had this name, Jean-Jacques Audubon, right? Very French. So he was in America now, and he wanted to seem, fit in a little better. So he decided to make his name more English sounding. So Jean-Jacques Rabin, or became Jean-Jacques Audubon, which became the English version, John James. So he's now John James Audubon. He comes to this property in 1803. So when he gets here, he's 18 years old. He's unattended, except for maybe his Quaker adopted mom, the tenant farmers, but he's really the landlord and really in charge. And so, what do you do if you're 18 and, have no supervision? Well, he enjoyed himself. He did what he loved. He was an outdoors person. He hunted, he fished, he ice skated in the winter. In the summer, he swam in the Perkiomen. And most importantly, he chased after girls. So just a little bit, I think I saw a raised hand. Kelly, do we have a question so far about Audubon?
I'm checking with Janet to see if she still has a question. Oh, she wants to know how you specifically came to Mill Grove.
How I came to Mill Grove by accident. So I came to Mill Grove. I actually started as a volunteer. I was in between jobs and taking some time off from work, and I was just looking for something to get me out of the house. And I actually started with the birds, just like Jill. And I actually was training chickens, because we had chickens at the time that we used for education programs for young children, that they can touch the birds, which you can't do with the raptors, at least not safely. And I started as a volunteer, and they had originally the property, when I started, there was a historic house and they were renovating it. And that had been the full museum. And they were getting ready to build a new museum and visitor center, which I'll give you a little peek at later. And I was asked, because of my experience, to kind of help out with some things. And I just kind of slowly got more and more positions. Then before I knew it, I was full-time and in charge of a whole bunch of stuff. So that is how I came to Audubon.
Happy accident.
Yes, a happy accident. Okay. I'll try to keep on top of those questions as we go. But real quick, we know Audubon is a famous artist and a scientist as well. And I just put up a slide here, kind of the scientific standard of the time. And what happened was, if you knew what a bird looked like, there was no internet. You couldn't tell what a bird in Africa looked like. You couldn't tell what a bird in South America was, unless you got on a sailing ship and it took you a month and you went to another continent, and then hopefully you would see one there. So the few texts that they had, kind of scientific standard of the time was, you didn't have a camera. You couldn't take a picture of the birds. A bird's fast, it flies away. You have to shoot it. So if you kind of see on the left there, there's unfortunately a dead bird, and on the right is a picture that looks very much like a dead bird. And that was very much the scientific standard. And it came on paper that was roughly the size that we use paper today. If you're thinking about like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, it was roughly that size. And if there was notes, like you see on the right, it says it's a blue jay, right, written out underneath it. If there was scientific notes, they would kind of be scribbled underneath it or on the next page. That's how people experienced birds. Now, Audubon, while he was here at Mill Grove, really fell in love with birds. He wrote very fondly about the property later in life. This is where he fell in birds. If it wasn't for this property, he wouldn't have necessarily done what he did. And he eventually wanted to share this with the world. So when he started painting or drawing birds, they didn't look like the scientific standard. He never thought, like, I want to be a scientist and this is how do they do it in Europe and this is how I want to do it. He kind of wanted to convey what he saw in real life. Right? And one of the ways he did that, which this next slide shows, is a wire armature. And this was something that he came up with. He writes in his journals, he had a dream and it came to him. This is how I can paint birds that look like real life. And he hops up and he runs down the stairs. He grabs his wallet, he runs down the stairs, and his homestay mom, we'll say the Quaker tenant farmer, said, "Do you want breakfast?" as he ran by. And he hopped on his horse and he rode into Norristown and he bought some wire and some pins and nails and what he needed, and he rode back and he burst back into the house, and the homestay mom was like, "John, you didn't eat?" And he grabs his gun and he runs back out and he runs down to the Perkiomen, and the first bird he sees is a kingfisher. And he shoots the kingfisher. And this is what we have here demonstrated as a kingfisher. And he gets an old piece of wood and he pins it up and he puts it in a lifelike pose. Now, he was an outdoors person. He was already falling in love with birds. He knew what they looked like. He knew how they perched on a branch. So he pinned it up how they perched. And then he put a grid behind it. And he knew the size of the squares in the grid. So he could paint to exact measurements. So one thing you'll find in Audubon's paintings that was revolutionary for the time is if it's an inch long beak in the picture, that's how long the beak was in real life. If it's 6 inches from beak to tail, that's how long the specimen in front of him was. So he had exacting measurements. Okay, let me show you. So Lucy Bakewell, remember I said he would hunt and he would fish and he would hike and he would swim and hit on girls? Well, the girl that lived across the street, her name was Lucy. And he happened to meet Lucy's father out hunting one day, and John needed a horse. And they got talking about horses, and Mr. Bakewell said, come on over. You know, I live right across the street. You want a horse? I'll sell you one. You can take a look if you're interested in any. And John kind of put it off for a while. And we're not really sure why, but I've always guessed it was because his English wasn't that good yet. But eventually he breaks down. He goes across the street to talk about horses. He knocks on the front doors and the servant brings John into a room, and sitting down is this young woman, and he writes in his journal, you know, how beautiful she was and that he fell instantly in love with her. And her name was Lucy. And good for John, not only did she strike his fancy, but Lucy was into a lot of things that John was. She was a very unusual woman for the time. You might use the term tomboy. She used to like to hike and do outdoors things as well. So she would hike with him. She would fish with him. She would swim with him. She would ice skate with him. And they fell madly in love with each other. And they wanted to get married. And their parents thought they were too young. And they didn't want them to get married. And their parents kind of tried to avoid this happening. And they just kept asking and asking. So eventually, they said, okay, well, I don't think we're going to be able to prevent this from happening. The parents agreed that if John could prove that he could support Lucy, find some sort of way to make money, that they could get married. Oh, I went a little too far there. All right, so we go to Henderson, Kentucky. Well, John goes out to Kentucky. He wants to marry Lucy. He's not making much money with the farm, so he sells, he actually splits the farm up into shares, and he sells most of his shares, and he goes into business with a childhood friend who was from France, and they go out to Kentucky. And they start in Louisville, and then he ends up in Henderson, and they open a dry goods store. Now, Kentucky at the time was the West. We don't think of it as West right now, but it was the frontier. And John realized that the country was really expanding, and he realized that people use the waterways for travel. And he figured if he could go to Kentucky and set up on the Mississippi, that it was a good spot. And he sold goods to all these people who were going out west and expanding into the country. And he did very, very well. So he went out there. He was out there in 1807. After a little bit over a year, he had done really well. He came back to the area. And across the street from Mill Grove, he went to Fatland Ford and he married Lucy, and he took her out to Kentucky with him. So now, John kind of had some ups and downs as a businessman. He did quite well in Kentucky, but then there was a national depression, and the banks crashed and failed, and a lot of people lost their money, and he kind of had overextended himself in one of his brother-in-law's ventures, which was a steam-powered mill, and he kind of got stuck, I think, by his brother-in-law, but that's a whole nother conversation. And so John kind of lost everything when he was out there after that. So in 1819, he kind of leaves Kentucky. He's got to do something. He actually he ends up going to debtor's prison, but luckily he knew some people and they got him out after a couple of days. Lucy and John have to sell all their items. He has to have a friend go to the auction and buy back his gun and his dog. So he has those things. And so he kind of moves around a little bit, and he goes to Cincinnati. He works at a museum in Ohio, and he's doing taxidermy, and he's painting backgrounds, and he's not really getting paid fully on time. So he ends up going down to the South. And this is a point where I think Lucy becomes very instrumental. You know, John had loved birds. He had painted birds. It was his thing. And I think this is really Lucy's influence. I believe he was prone to bouts of depression just from reading his journals. And she was his guiding force. And she was kind of like, I think what she said was, I'm kind of sick of listening to you. Just go do the bird book, right? You've been talking about it. You've been painting the paintings. Just do it. And this is really bad for him personally when it comes to, you know, his wallet, but good for us because it's really when he starts the venture of painting the birds of America. Now, let me cut back here. He did have a family while I was in Kentucky. He had two sons, Victor and John Woodhouse, and they were the ones that lived into adulthood. He did have some daughters who did not make it into adulthood, unfortunately. And they kind of become instrumental in the story later. So John heads down south after he's in Ohio, and he starts painting the birds of the South because he had painted the birds in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Kentucky. And he had been up to New York and New Jersey. So now he wants to go down south and paint the birds there. Okay, but if you don't have anything, like he only had his gun and his dog, and that was only because a buddy bought him back at the auction. You know, how do you feed yourself? So John did several things, and one of which he's not really known for, but he painted portraits. So this portrait here happens to be in the collection here at the John James Audubon Center, and it's a portrait of his brother-in-law. Now, this wouldn't have been one that he did for money. This would have been a gift, but it gives you a good example that he could do portraits as well. So this was a pencil drawing, but when he was in the South, he drew and painted portraits for money. He looked for commissions. He did other things as well. Pretty much anything anyone would pay him for. He taught lessons in fencing. He was a really good dancer, so he taught dance. Of course, he did art. He would often try to find a rich family who would pay for him to be a tutor in art, and he would live on their plantation or on their property. And then he would paint all the birds in that area, and he would stay until either he had worn out his welcome or until he had painted all the birds in the area, and then he would try to move on to another area to paint the birds. All right. So I kind of fast forward till 1826. John went all over the country, and he's an amazing fellow. There's a lot of stories about him. Some of them you wouldn't believe. But in 1826, he finally has enough birds. He hasn't painted every bird in North America, but he's got enough that he can make a business of it, make a go of it. And he ends up going to Scotland to find an engraver. He tries to find one in Philadelphia, and he doesn't quite do so well. The head of the Natural Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia kind of has money invested in a book that's by a different ornithologist, and John is a much better artist, so he kind of tries to sabotage him. But he's a very polarizing figure, so either people loved him or hated him. He was a larger than life. He told big stories. He did amazing things and crazy things, and his art was so different. If you look at the turkey on the right, that's what a turkey looked like in real life. And remember, I showed the picture of the dead flat blue jay. That's how the scientific standard was. So in the scientific world in Philadelphia, people were like, we're a young country. We're supposed to follow the standards of what's going on in Europe, and this isn't the standards. So they were very threatened by that or didn't like it. And it was kind of 50-50. The other half of people loved his art and said, this is amazing. You know, this is how we should all do it. But regardless, he ends up going to Scotland, and he finds someone to help him make a book of all the birds of North America. And the engraver, as you see there, is William Lazars. and he does the first few paintings, engraves them so they can make prints of the engravings for John's book of Birds of America. So I am walking back in the museum because I'm going to show you a couple of things right now. So how do you make a print, right? This is before laser copies and all the modern printing technology. So you got a little sneak peek at our museum here. If I can get my screen to show you what I want. I don't want to be sharing my screen anymore. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. Can you see me?
It's the
No?
same. Do you want me to turn your share off?
Yeah, can you turn my share off for a minute then? All right, can you see me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, it's really hard to see because it's behind a case, but this is a copper plate. So Lazar's, the engraver I told you about, he takes a giant copper plate and he's a master engraver and he etches out the plate. And actually it's a fairly complicated process where he covers it in wax and he scratches off what he wants to be the darkest part of the picture. And then they dip it in acid and the wax protects the metal from the acid, but where it was scratched off, it eats away a little bit of the metal. And then they pull it out of the acid and they rinse it off and then he'll scratch more out. And then they dip it again and they do that repeatedly and repeatedly. And the first part that was scratched out becomes the darkest, most etched part of the plate. So when you print, you don't just get a black and white printing because of the levels and depth of the multiple etchings. You get a black and white, but really gray tone on tone with darker and lighter areas. So you see this print, this is one of John's paintings, and they made that master engraving, and then they printed it in this black and white with the tones of light and dark. So that's what you get. So how do you get from that into a beautiful piece of artwork that people can buy, right? So you have to color it. So it was really a production process. So all of John's prints are carved on a printing plate and they're printed and then they're hand colored with watercolors. So I'm going to walk you over slow and show you a print. So the same exact print that you just saw with the black and white gray tones colored in. Okay. Well, John was fairly demanding, so it wasn't just quite that easy. If you look at this next picture here, see it? This is cut, but it's a corner of one of those printings with notes, right? So the notes are, you know, this needs to be adjusted, this needs to be fixed. And he was very demanding. So both with the engraving process and with the coloring of the plates. So my next plate that I show in your PowerPoint will be the second engraver that John used because he didn't really get what he wanted with the first engraver. So then he went to London and he found an engraver that was actually a little bit better and more importantly, cheaper. So it was a win-win situation. He ends up using that engraver instead. We actually have here, unfortunately, it's not on exhibit right now, it's out of rotation, but we have a color proof where there's a print and it's colored in, and it was the proof given to John Audubon, and he writes notes on it. This color is good, this one needs to be darker, this needs to be lighter. But how did they get that? So what they did is they would have John's original painting of the bird set up, and there was people who were professional artists. This is what they did, and they colored prints, and they would make an assembly line. They were usually women, and they would line up. And so if I was good at the beak, I would do the beak, and I would pass it off, and I would, you know, someone else would do the claws, and someone else would do the feathers, and someone would do the background plants. And it would get down the line, and then if Audubon looked at it and he didn't like it, he would tear it up or crumble it up, and he'd throw it away and say, start over and do it this way. So he was notorious for being very demanding. But because of that, when you look at these prints, you cannot tell that they were all one of a kind unless you're an art expert, really. There's so little deviation and variation in them because he was so demanding, and then the women that were coloring them were so good at their job. There's very little differences in them. So unless you're really good at what you do and looking under a magnifying glass, it's really hard to tell that there's any differences. So, okay. I would like to share my screen again. Kelly, if you could do that, or I guess I could hit the button.
Yep, the green button down there.
All right. And all right. Come on. There he goes. All right. So Robert Havel and Robert Havel Jr. were a father and son team of engravers. And am I too echoey, or do you hear me okay?
You sound okay.
Okay, because in the gallery it can be a little echoey if I want to make sure that's okay for you guys. So Havel ends up doing prints like 6 through 436, the majority of the book. The original ones were done by Lazars. Some of those engravings were actually touched up by Havel in later printing, so you do get some variation of those early prints, which makes those ones rarer and more expensive. But Audubon, what a lot of people don't know is like they think he just printed these prints and then made a book, and that's how it happened, and he was done. Well, he hadn't painted all the birds in America, and he didn't know how many there were. But his goal was to paint them all. So what do you do? Well, so what he did was he sold them in subscription, which was a common thing back then, subscription. And he sold 5 prints at a time. And he had a very detailed way of how he figured out. He had one big bird, at least one big bird, smaller birds. He would try to put a bird of prey in there. He had a whole formula, so it would keep people interested in it, and you would get 5 at a time. And Audubon was known to be a wonderful salesman. And so what he would do is, once he got kind of the operation up and going, these were getting printed, and he approved of the proofs of the ones that were being printed. He actually went back to America, and they were sending people their prints 5 at a time, you know, every month. And he went and he was painting new birds. He was hunting in America. He was shooting birds. He was using that wire armature that we had discussed, and he was painting birds, and he just kind of kept going. So you will find individual prints that are Audubon's, like the one I showed you on the wall, that weren't ever in a book. So, you know, how does he become known for a book? Well, what you do is when you're done, or you decide you're done, then you figure out what will be the best vision for your book. Is it one book? Is it 4 volumes in a book, 3 volumes, 6 volumes, whatever you want? And then that's when you send out the table of contents and the introduction, and that will tell with instruction sheet to your bookbinder how to split up the book. And then you bring your book to your local bookbinder. And that's where the books come. So when you hear about the big book or Audubon's Birds of America, you see it today in book form, but it wasn't always a book, but it was always meant to be a book. But of course, some of the people who were in subscription didn't stay till the end. So that's why you get loose prints. They could be from a broken up book. And if they're intact in one piece, you know that because the holes are in the binding, from the binding. So you see holes where the binding was sewed together. So sometimes they're trimmed down so you can't tell. But most of those individual ones were people who had the subscription and never finished the subscription. That being said, he would go back to Europe, back to England to check on the process. And when he would get there, you know, they'd say, well, so many people dropped out and don't want them anymore. And he was known for going to their houses and knocking on their doors and saying, hey, are you sure you really want to cancel this? And getting them to sign back up. Now, that being said, if you were buying one of these books or these prints, you weren't the average person. You were a person of means. It was probably the equivalent of about $10,000 today to get one of these books. So if you had to be an institution to be able to afford it, or someone who is quite wealthy. Okay. I am going to show you. So I was trying to stick to a lot of birds that you would see in this area, since most of the people on this call, I believe, are from this area. Swamp sparrow is not one of them, but I always like to throw this into my presentations, because if you see the zoom in on the bottom right there, the Drawn from Nature by Lucy Audubon, I just always wondered, how bad did he mess up that he his apology was saying, because we can tell from the brushstrokes and all that Lucy most likely didn't paint this bird, that Audubon did, but he says it was drawn by nature by Lucy. So I always find that quite humorous, because I feel like that was an apology note in the book. All right. So here we have a swan. Doesn't seem that unusual, but if you kind of look at the swan, look at its position. It is a natural position, but see how its head is turned back to look at the moth? Well, the reason for this is Audubon found the largest paper that was readily available to do his paintings. And the reason he did that was he wanted to present, like I said, what he saw in real life. And he painted them in exacting dimensions. So, like I said, if they were small, he painted them small. He would either paint more of them or he would take up less of them. But big birds need big paper. So he found this giant paper. It was the biggest paper he could find. But that paper wasn't always big enough, right? So he would have to get a little creative with his positioning sometimes. So you'll see some of these bigger birds, the swan, its head would be off the paper. So it's looking back at this little moth that was drawn in. The eagle fits on the paper. I just really like the eagle, so you get the eagle in there. But the eagle is a good example of what he would do. So he wouldn't only just paint the bird. He would put its habitat in there in the background. So you would see a very common habitat for it. You would see common foods. So in the area he was at when he painted the eagle, it was near water. Eagles often will eat fish. So he puts catfish in there, because that would be something common that an eagle would eat. The flamingo on the right is not necessarily a local bird here in Pennsylvania, but you can see how its neck is down to get a drink of water there, and that's how he fit it into the frame. Now, like tree sparrows, you see that there's two of them and some plant there because he kind of filled the space. But sometimes it didn't actually fill the full space. Now, Audubon's famous for painting birds, but as he got older, he had finished the bird project, and he had always kind of thought he would do mammals, but he was older and realized that he wouldn't be able to necessarily do all the mammals. So he kind of settles on four-legged mammals. They give live birth. It still doesn't kind of down that many, and he starts this project. But if you kind of look at this fox on the left-hand side, not necessarily really fox-looking, right? It was harder for him. He was older and he was kind of sickly, and he couldn't travel like he used to. So he couldn't go and see the animals in necessarily their natural habitat. So some of these animals were just drawn from the skin that was sent to him. So it would be a preserved skin. Well, so he kind of had to guess the shape. So you'll see some of his like foxes and kind of look more like dogs a little bit. And then some of the paintings also aren't quite as good, but when you look at the fine print, his sons helped him on this. And although they were better artists than I am, they weren't quite as good as John. So some of the paintings are done by his sons and aren't quite as good of art that we would consider that Audubon would normally do. So Audubon, when he left here, we talked about him going to Kentucky. He went down south, he traveled all around to paint the birds. But the three places he really settled in America were here at Mill Grove, where he fell in love with the birds and Lucy, in Kentucky, and then in New York State. And he lived in Manhattansville. It was actually in a farm just outside of Manhattansville, the village of Manhattan. So you see the idyllic looking picture at the bottom because it was a farm and it was kind of in the woods. But you see the picture on the right, the city has expanded. So it's really Washington Heights area now. But back when he lived there in the 1840s, it was not the middle of the city. It was a farm outside of the city. So he lived to 1851 when he passed away. And he is buried in New York City because that's where he was at the time. Now, Lucy outlived him by 23 years. So here's pictures of Lucy, a little bit different than the picture that was from before. And the picture that I had in the slide before was actually a drawing, although a lot of people think it's a photograph. So this is a much older Lucy. Now, Lucy, in her own right, should be celebrated, not only because she was the driving force behind John, who really kind of kicked him in the rear whenever he was down and said, you're going to do this, let's go. And always supported him, but also supported the family so he could be out in the woods when they burned through his money and her money, and she got a job so she could support the kids while he was out painting. But also, a lot of people don't know is her influence on the people after her in the conservation movement. John James Audubon became such a famous painter that people really idolized him. So in the late 1800s, he was so famous, people wanted to know about him. Well, he had passed away in 1851. So for the next 20 some years, people would seek out his widow to ask about him. Among these were George Bird Grinnell, who started the National Audubon Society, and Teddy Roosevelt. Right? And they would ask stories about John and what he did and how he did this. So she was very influential on the conservation movement before it was really a movement. All right. Okay. Kind of lasting things in John's repertoire are he did things that maybe aren't as easy to do now because there's more known, but back then it was a lot of wilderness. So he painted 6 species that are now extinct, one of which is the passenger pigeon you see on the right and the Carolina parakeet that's on the left. Yes, we had a parakeet in mainland US, not just the tropics. It was the only one, and unfortunately passed away because of loss of habitat. So he identified 25 new species. He really raised that scientific standard. He raised the bar. So now when scientists, put things in books, they really felt that they had to be the proper proportions. That wasn't a thing before. And they also wanted their stuff to look good, which wasn't really a thing before. He really became the benchmark when it came to drawings of nature, in particular birds. And even to this day, if you hear someone like Roger Tory Peterson or David Sibley talk, they all say, well, I was influenced by Audubon. I grew up looking at Audubon pictures. And he's inspired, naturalists and scientists for hundreds of years. Okay, so right here, I've shown you a picture of size, what a human looks like compared to the big book, as we call it. And that's just one volume of the Birds of America. So there's 4 volumes in every set. So a little bit over 100 pictures in each one. And that's what it looks like. And if you come to our visitor center museum, you can see one in person. So Kelly, if you could take me off a share, or I could hit the stop share button, whatever.
There you go.
Can you see me?
Yes.
All right. So this is what the book looks like. And it's in this giant case, which is longer than I am tall, and actually a little shorter than me when it comes to height. So that is the book. I would encourage you to come see it in person if you get the opportunity. There are a couple in the Philadelphia area. There's one at the Academy of Natural Sciences. I honestly don't know who's open nowadays that you can see these things. So, if you do some research, make sure you call ahead and see if you can get in to see one. Our museum is twofold. There's a whole hall on birds and science and there's a whole hall on Audubon, his history, and his art. So we encourage you to come take a look at it. And then at 1 o'clock, we have tours to the historic house where Audubon actually lived, where you can go down and learn about the history of the property and Audubon. So please come and visit us. And I don't know, do we have any time left? I can answer questions if we do, but I do not have to.
I haven't seen any questions come in yet, but if people would want to come over and tour, do they need to book tickets ahead of time?
Good question. So they do not have to book tickets ahead of time. They can get tickets online. They can just buy them when they come at the front desk. The benefit to having a brand new modern visitor center is it's very well spaced out. It's easy to social distance. So that doesn't seem to be a problem for us, thankfully. But we are only open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So make sure you come on one of those days if you want to come into the visitor center. We do have 200 plus acres here. So it is a county park. The property is owned by the county. It's operated by Audubon Society. So it's a partnership there. And the park itself is open every day during daylight hours. We have miles and miles of walking trails. So you can come hike, picnic, use it as a park. No pets, please. It's a bird sanctuary as well. So please do not bring any pets. And we have rescue birds because you've met one already, but we do have 5 owls. We do have a broad-winged hawk, a blue jay, and then a couple of chickens. So they're not rescues. They're just here to hang out.
All right. I'm getting many thank yous coming through, but I haven't seen any questions yet. I'm going to allow you guys to unmute yourself if you have a question you would like to speak at this time. Oh, you guys did so well earlier. I know there's in there.
Well, that just means my presentation was so amazing that I answered all the questions.
Did you
Usually I get at least one question about my hair.
And more thank yous.
Well, it was my pleasure. I was happy I could come toot my own horn about our site, and I love history, so I will talk. If any of you are history nerds, you can come here and I'll talk for hours about whatever you want. And yeah, I always enjoy doing presentations. So
Great, thank you, Mike. If anybody does have any further questions, you will be getting a follow-up email from me, so you can always put them in there. We can try and get something answered for you, or go to the museum and check it out. Seems awesome, and now that the weather's getting nicer, make a day out of it. It would be great. I'm gonna make this last call then. This information was so interesting. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Over and over again. Thanks, Mike. Looks like you did a good job.
My pleasure.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming out.
Good night.